happens.
My shoes are wet.
Did you press go? You pressed go. Okay, great. It's a very slow pan. It's a very slow pan. All right. So I'm going to tell you guys a story tonight, and it's a very old story, and it's been told by a lot of different people in a lot of different ways, and for a lot of different reasons. A long time ago, it was told by the Greeks, and they told it to talk about death and art and the timeline of those two things. In the Middle Ages, it was turned into what's called a Breton lay, and it was this stupid romantic little foray where they took the tragedy out, took the gods out, brought in fairies and courtly romance, and called it good. And then, most recently, that I know of, it was turned into a folk opera by a woman named Nias Mitchell, which you should all check out. It's called Hadestown. I'm going to be telling you the Greek one, with some influences from the other two, but mostly the Greek. So, a long time ago, there was a man named Orpheus. And Orpheus was not particularly smart. He wasn't all that clever in any way, and he wasn't that handsome, or strong, or quick. There wasn't much remarkable about Orpheus, but he could play music amazingly well. And when Orpheus played music, everyone listened. And when I say everyone, I mean everyone. Any musician can influence the hearts and minds of humans. That's a fairly common thing for mortal minstrels. But Orpheus was unique in the scope of his audience. When Orpheus played, the rocks listened, and the trees listened, and the wind quieted itself so that it could hear him better. And so Orpheus made a life out of this. He traveled around, and he played for the elements and for the gods, and nymphs and dryads listened to him. And everywhere he went, men and women and gods fell in love with him. And he had this beautiful romantic life of travel where he was never attached. But, of course, he fell in love. And he fell in love with a young woman named Euclide. And Euclide. And Euclide, unfortunately for Orpheus, was a very practical woman. She was soft of voice. She always tread very quietly, but she had a very good life at home, and she wasn't about to give it all up to travel with some wandering minstrel. And so when Orpheus asked for her hand in marriage, she told him, "I am considering it, but first, I have to ask you a few questions. Every night you sleep in your cloak, wrapped up underneath the stars. If I am to be your wife, I will need more than that. I will need a marriage bed." And Orpheus just smiled, and he played his harp, and from the skies came thousands of birds, and each of them plucked from their breast a single feather and laid them in this great pile on the ground. And Orpheus said, "This will be our marriage bed. Here we will sleep." And Euclide was pleased with this, and she said, "That's all well and good, but I've seen you beg scraps from the tables of men greater than you, and if I am to travel with you and maybe someday bear you children, I will need to be sure that we will be well fed." And Orpheus smiled, and he began to play, and suddenly the trees around him bowed down and flowered, and those flowers ripened into fruit. And Euclide looked around at the olives and apples and plums, and she was, again, well pleased. But then she said, "Orpheus, how will people know we are married? We will need rings." And this stumped Orpheus for a minute, because while he knew the rocks listened to him, rocks are not known for their dancing, and so he wasn't certain that he would be able to convince them to give up their precious minerals. And so he thought for a long while, and then an idea came to him. And he bowed his head over his harp, and he began to play, and the river rose from its bank and deposited on the shore all of the tiny fragments of gold and mica and precious stones that flowed through its heart. And Euclide sighed and decided it was good enough. It wasn't quite a ring, but she could get something done with it. And so she agreed to marry him. And unfortunately, this is where the story takes a sadder turn. They had been married scarcely a week when Euclide rose early one morning and went for a walk through the dewy grass of a meadow. As I mentioned before, Euclide walked very quietly. And so it was that, through no malicious intent, merely surprise, a snake happened to be trod upon and bite her in the heel. and she died. She died from the venom in her bloodstream. And Orpheus came and found her and went a little bit mad. And for the next several weeks, he wandered through the wilderness. His music, once beautiful, now a horrible lament. Still beautiful, but so raw and full of pain that people couldn't stand to listen to it for very long. And the birds would not come near him. Men and women turned him away. And finally, the dryads and nymphs who had to hear him because they were in the trees and rivers and couldn't really go anywhere, they rose up and told him of a plan. They told him that they knew of a secret cave that led to the underworld. And if he was able to convince the stone that barred that cave's entrance to move aside, that he would perhaps be able to descend to the underworld and retrieve Euclides. And Orpheus, not knowing what else to do, agreed. And so the nymphs and dryads took him to this cave and showed him this great stone that stood in front. And Orpheus, not knowing of how else to move the stone, he solves most of his problems with music, began to play. And he played, and the stone didn't budge. And he played, and he channeled the pain that he was feeling at the loss of his love into his music, and he began to weep. And as he wept, he saw beads of moisture form on the stone, and he knew that he was getting across. But a crying stone doesn't grant access, and so something else had to happen. And so he played more, and he played till his back bent over the lute, and he began to curl up, and his hands began to cramp, and the stone too, he could see in sympathy, was beginning to shrink and crack. But that wasn't enough either. He couldn't crawl through these tiny fissures, and so something else had to be done. And so he kept playing, and his fingers began to bleed, and he kept playing, and suddenly one of the strings snapped, and with it his heart, because he was sure that this was his last chance, and that he was never going to be able to see his love again. But in that instant, the stone, which was so encaptured by his music, shattered as well, and became this cloud of fine sand that settled on the floor of the cave, and he was able to pass through. From there, he wandered down miles of dark stone. He had brought no torch because he's, as I mentioned before, not a clever man. And so he wandered down, feeling with his bloody hands the cold stone. He felt the stone get hotter and then cold again as he approached Hades. And he came upon a boatman, and the boatman, not knowing what to make of him, granted him access. And he came upon a three-headed dog, and the three-headed dog is not nearly as fearsome as the stories may leave, and the three-headed dog let him pie as well. It's mostly there to keep people from getting out, you see. And he found himself in the fields of Hades. And in every direction, as far as he could see, were endless fields of wandering souls. And he could see at first no rhyme or reason in their pattern or why they moved or where they moved. And they didn't understand him, for they didn't remember what it was like to be alive. But eventually, he noticed that there was a sort of pattern. The souls of the dead seemed to be moving in a sort of current towards a single point. And so he joined their march, this grim progression, and he eventually came upon the Garden of Persephone. And the souls are drawn to the Garden of Persephone because alone in the underworld, Persephone remembers what it is to be alive. And Persephone brings down to this dark realm a touch of spring and a memory of wind and rain and the moon and the sky. And so the dead are drawn to her, and so too was Orpheus. And so he entered into this garden, which was a mockery of the gardens above. All the plants were black and withered, though she cared for them as best she could. He came to Persephone and asked, "I am looking for my love, Euclides, and I cannot find her in these fields. And I wish to take her back to the surface." And Euclides, of course, knows something about being trapped in the underworld and knows the sorrow attached. And so she brought him before Hades. And he made his plea again, but Hades is a cold-hearted king, and he sat there with his great helm upon his brow and his dark cloak about his shoulders and did not care. And so Orpheus began to play, because as I've mentioned many times, he has no other solution for his problems. And so he began to play with his bleeding fingers, with his harp already missing a string. He began to play. And he played until he bent over and his fingers began to cramp. But Hades remained straight, and he played until he wept but Hades' eyes were dry, and at last he played until his entire harp and heart with it shattered. But Hades' heart was a heart of stone, and he did not care. And so Orpheus collapsed in despair and would have remained there if not for Persephone. And Persephone came to Hades, and she told him in no uncertain terms that this was something he had to do for her. And she reminded him of the love he felt for her, and she reminded him of how he once too went to another land and brought back his love. She reminded him that in time all things return to him, for all things in the end will die. She reminded him that even his brothers will at last come to visit and live with him when the gods die. And Hades saw, with the logic of kings, that he could not let this man go, and he could not let him take his wife, because if he would, he knew that next others would want the same, that if he let this small kindness go, others would expect greater kindness, and he knew that this would ripple out, and in time, the entire kingdom would fall, all for a song. And so he knew he couldn't let this happen, but he also knew that he could not let his wife be angry with him, and Hades is a clever man, and so he created another solution. He told Orpheus, "I will let you take your wife, but you must agree to some conditions." And Orpheus, breaking out of tears, immediately said, "Yes, anything, I will agree." And Hades said, "My conditions are this: you will not return to this land until it is your fated time. Secondly, when you leave, Euclides will walk behind you, and you may not look upon her until you reach the surface." And Orpheus agreed, because he had no other recompense. And Hades brought out from the fields the spirit of Euclides, but first made Orpheus turn his back. And when Euclides was behind him, he told Orpheus, "Your love is with you, now go." And they walked past the three-headed dog who Hades had told to let them pass. And they walked to the boatmen, who, still confused, ferried them across the river Styx. And they walked the tall stairway. And here it was that doubt first entered in. For as I've mentioned before, Euclides walked with a very soft step. And as Orpheus began to climb, he at first climbed with great speed, ready and eager to reach the surface and be gone of this dismal land and be reunited with his wife. But then he realized that he could no longer hear her footsteps behind him, and so he slowed down. In time, he thought he heard her return, and so he began to, continue up the stairs. But then he began to wonder again, and he thought he knew the stories of Hades, and he knew that Hades was a clever man, and he realized he had no assurance that the spirit behind him truly was his wife. He had agreed to never return here. Whatever power he had used to return was gone. His heart was broken. How did he know he wasn't a plaything of the gods? And these thoughts festered in his mind as he climbed, until at last he reached the cave and he could see sunlight. And these thoughts were pounding in his mind, a horrible percussion that filled his thoughts. And he was certain he had been tricked. He was certain that he was being made a fool of, that he would step beyond the cave and realize that it had all been for naught. And so, determined not to have a god laugh at him, he looked back and checked. And he got one final glimpse of the shade of his wife, and then the stone slammed shut in front of him. And Euclides was left on the other side. And she was left with having just seen a glimpse of the sunlight, having seen her husband in the sunlight, and left with nothing. But Persephone came to her and brought her down and brought her to her garden and transformed her into a songbird and perched her on the pomegranate tree and told her forever to sing of this story, and told her that as long as she